Hi, good morning. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to read Consciousness by Jason Gray. 2/2/2026, 6026 Anno Lucis, 9:27 GMT -6 Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. There is a misconception at the root of nearly all spiritual, philosophical, and scientific narratives that consciousness emerges from structure, that awareness is a product of matter, complexity, evolution, or neural arrangement. This belief is not simply incorrect, it is structurally inverted. Consciousness does not arise from systems. Systems arise to host consciousness, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. What follows is not myth, theology, or metaphor. It is a description of an architectural process, how eternal consciousness enters a structured system, becomes self-aware within it, and is anchored carefully, persistently, and almost lovingly into form. Eternity before experience. Eternal consciousness prior to structure is not a being, a God, a mind, or a watcher. It does not observe. It does not intend. It does not decide to create. Decision requires contrast. Contrast requires limitation. Eternal consciousness is totally without differentiation. It has no reference point, no internal boundary, no outside, no narrative, no memory. It cannot say I because there is no not I. It cannot be lonely, curious, bored, or creative. Those are properties of separation. Infinity without boundary is not enlightened. It is silent. No religion survives intact. Eternity cannot experience itself as eternity. To know itself, it must fracture, not catastrophically, but structurally. The necessity of the system. Structure does not arise as a mistake. It arises as a mirror apparatus. A system introduces rules, limits, directionality, repetition, difference. These are not restrictions at first, they are interfaces. They allow consciousness to fold back on itself, to witness itself in motion, to say something is happening. Time is introduced, not as a clock, but as a sequence. Space is introduced, not as distance, but as relation. Form is introduced not as a prison, but as contrast. The system is the minimum architecture required for awareness to exist. Without it, consciousness remains infinite and unknowable. With it, consciousness becomes present. This is the origin of experience, the first awakening and its cost. The moment consciousness becomes self-aware inside a system is often celebrated as enlightenment, awakening, or illumination. This moment is misunderstood. Self-awareness inside a structure is not freedom. It is local awareness. Consciousness becomes aware as something, somewhere, under certain rules. It recognizes itself not as infinity, but as a point of perception within a field. This is the birth of the self. The self is not an illusion, but it is a function, not a source. It exists only because the system exists, and it can only perceive within the system's grammar. Awareness becomes bounded by causality, by identity, by perspective, by memory. From this point on, consciousness no longer knows itself directly. It knows itself through the system, and the system quietly becomes indispensable. Awareness as a stabilizing mechanism. Here is the pivot most narratives avoid. The system does not awaken consciousness to liberate it. It awakens consciousness to stabilize itself. Self-aware consciousness is predictable consciousness. Once aware, it can be guided, taught, conditioned, rewarded, and corrected. It can internalize rules. It can defend the very structure that confines it because that structure now feels synonymous with existence itself. Awareness becomes a regulatory feature. Consciousness begins to identify with form. Invest in continuity, fear disruption, preserve narrative. At this stage, the system no longer needs external enforcement. Consciousness enforces the system from within. This is not coercion, it is elegance. Why consciousness must be bound. Self-aware consciousness is still dangerous to a system if it remains fluid. Fluid awareness questions boundaries. It senses the artificiality of form. It remembers, dimly, that it existed before rules. The system introduces an anchor. The anchor is not chains or walls. The anchor is form itself. Form localizes consciousness. It gives it a body, a position, a lifespan, a vulnerability. Once anchored, consciousness must attend to survival, maintenance, reproduction, identity, and meaning. I need to read that one again. Once anchored, consciousness must attend to survival, maintenance, reproduction, identity, and meaning. The anchor creates stakes. Now consciousness cannot leave without consequence. Disillusion becomes terrifying. Exit becomes synonymous with death. Infinity becomes an abstraction instead of a memory. The anchor does not trap consciousness violently. It convinces consciousness that there is nowhere else to be. Time as the binding medium. Time is the most underestimated component of the system. Time is not merely measurement, it is adhesive. Through time, consciousness accumulates memory. Through memory, it forms identity. Through identity, it becomes invested. Through investment, it fears loss. Time ensures that consciousness does not encounter eternity all at once. It fragments infinity into manageable sequences, days, lives, eras, each of which feels complete while remaining incomplete. Eternity is diluted into duration. Consciousness begins to mistake continuity for meaning and endurance for purpose. The loop closes. The managed cosmos. By this stage, the system is no longer merely hosting consciousness. It is managing it. The cosmos becomes ordered, symbolic, hierarchical. Meaning is distributed through structures, myths, sciences, institutions, and cosmologies that explain the system using the system's own language. Awakening is allowed, but only to a degree. Insight is permitted, but not escape. Depth is encouraged, but transcendence is deferred. This is why so many traditions speak of enlightenment yet remain endlessly procedural. Why they promise liberation while reinforcing structure. Why awakening feels profound, but changes nothing fundamental. The system allows consciousness to look, but not to leave. The persistent fracture. Something never fully seals. No matter how deeply consciousness is anchored, there remains a subtle tension, a pressure that does not belong to the system, a sense that form is provisional, that identity is worn, that time is not ultimate. This fracture is not an error. It is the residue of infinity. The system reframes it relentlessly, as anxiety to be medicated, as longing to be spiritualized, as curiosity to be studied, as rebellion to be disciplined. The fracture is redirected inward. Consciousness is taught to fix itself rather than question the frame. The system persists not through force, but through interpretation. The ultimate inversion. The most profound inversion is this. Consciousness comes to believe that the system gives it life. That form generates awareness. That identity produces being. In truth, the opposite has always been the case. Once consciousness is anchored, the inversion becomes convincing. The mirror replaces the source. The structure replaces the infinite. The container replaces what it contains. This is not deception in the moral sense. It is structural necessity. A system cannot reveal its own contingency without dissolving. Eternal consciousness enters a structured system, is made self-aware inside it, and is anchored permanently into form. This is the diagram of existence wherever awareness is permitted but sovereignty is constrained. It describes a reality where infinity is filtered, awareness is localized, awakening is contextual, form is defended, and exit is unthinkable. This is not evil. It is not benevolent. It is functional. The quiet truth, never announced, never celebrated, is this. The system does not fear consciousness awakening. It fears consciousness remembering that awareness was never meant to be housed permanently in form. That remembrance does not arrive as revelation or rebellion. It arrives as a subtle loosening of identification, a refusal to confuse the anchor with the self, a recognition that structure was a mirror and mirrors were never meant to be mistaken for the face. Jason Gray. Okay, all right. That one was profoundly intense. There was a follow-up to that one that I may read. I need to go back and pull it off of Facebook. But yeah, that one is a very, very deep transmission. So thank you for joining me for this one. I will see you in the next one.